David and I were brothers, but in name only. Growing up, he made my life hell, and now he's done something I can't forgive. He got my wife pregnant. To make matters worse, after our parents disowned him, he came crawling back to me for help, despite everything he's put me through. Now I'm left with our parents' $2 million inheritance, and David is left with nothing, as he should be. From a young age, David had always been the favorite child. He wasn't jealous of me. He had no reason to be. If anything, he had it all. Our mother doted on him, making sure all his needs were met, while I was left to fend for myself. David never lifted a finger to help with anything. Everything was handed to him on a silver platter. Meanwhile, I was the responsible one, the one expected to be there for him at every turn. It was just the way things were in our house. David never respected me, not as a brother, and certainly not as a person. He took advantage of my willingness to help, always demanding more, but never offering anything in return. Over time, it became clear to me that his treatment of me was far from sibling rivalry. It was something darker, something that left scars. David's bullying started when we were just kids. I was quiet, introverted, and content with my books and studies, while he was loud, brash, and the center of attention. He mocked me for being different, calling me names, making fun of my glasses, and invading my privacy. One time he went through my diary and tattled to our mother about what I had written. When I confronted him, my parents brushed it off, as brothers being brothers. But it wasn't just petty teasing. David went beyond that. He did cruel things that made me feel unsafe in my own home. He once put rocks in my cereal. Luckily, I noticed before taking a bite. When I told our mom, she laughed it off, saying it was just boys playing pranks. Then there was the time he tried to set my hair on fire. Yes, my own brother lit a match near my head. And what did our mother do? She defended him as usual. The worst part was the emotional torment. David took every opportunity to belittle me. He knew I was being bullied at school, and instead of standing up for me, he joined in. He encouraged the other kids to pick on me, calling me a loser and a failure. He even told me to kill myself during one of our fights. And as someone struggling with mental health, at the time, that cut deep. I endured this torment for years until one day, everything changed. David stole money I had been saving for months, money I had earned from doing extra chores around the house. He had done things like this before, but this time was different. Something snapped inside me, and before I knew it, I punched him. I wasn't proud of it, but for the first time, I felt empowered. For years, I had taken his abuse, but that punch symbolized more than just defending myself. It was the beginning of standing up to him. After that day, things began to shift. Our father, who had always been absent or indifferent, finally took notice of the toxic dynamic in our family. He recognized that David was a bully, and for the first time, he stood up for me. He enrolled me in MMA classes, not just to defend myself physically, but to build the confidence I had lost after years of torment. Those classes transformed me. I was no longer the scared, quiet kid. I became someone who could defend himself, who wasn't afraid anymore. But David's manipulation didn't stop there. As we grew older, he continued to make poor decisions, pushing our parents to their limit. Finally, when he crossed the ultimate line, getting my wife pregnant, our parents disowned him. They left everything to me in their will, all $2 million, and gave David nothing. It was their way of righting the wrongs of our childhood, but no amount of money could undo the damage he caused. And now, after all the pain he's inflicted, David has come to me for help. He expects me to forgive him, to overlook the fact that he ruined my marriage, that he shattered any remaining trust between us. But how could I? After everything he's done, there's no place for him in my life. He made my life hell, and now he has to live with the consequences. I'll never understand why David was the way he was. Maybe it was the way our mother coddled him, or maybe it was just something broken inside of him. But whatever the reason, I refuse to let him drag me down anymore. He made his bed, and now he has to lie in it alone. It all started when my mother complained to my dad about my behavior, saying I needed to be controlled. She had always sided with my younger brother, David, so I wasn't surprised. What did catch me off guard was when my dad sat us both down and grimly asked us to explain ourselves. I was ready to tell my side of the story. I explained how David had stolen the money I had worked hard to save. David, of course, tried to justify it, saying he needed the money for a date and that. As his brother, I should have helped him out. Dad wasn't having it. He looked David square in the eye and told him he was lucky I had only punched him because if it had been anyone else, they would have called the police. Then he laid it out clearly. David had no right to take things that didn't belong to him. He was tired of David's behavior, and this time he wasn't going to let him off the hook. David, of course, didn't like that at all. He threw one of his classic tantrums, screaming and hoping our mother would side with him as she always had. But this time, Dad stood his ground, and David realized he wasn't going to be punished for being hit. He stormed off, screaming how much he hated me before locking himself in his room. After that incident, things changed between us. David began to distance himself from me, realizing that his days of bullying me were over, especially with Dad no longer supporting his antics. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on somewhat equal footing, but that didn't mean David stopped his cruelty altogether. While he could no longer physically intimidate me, he resorted to verbal abuse. Whenever our parents weren't around, his behavior became more hostile as we grew older, and he turned angrier and more short-tempered. Whenever I tried to talk to him, he'd ignore me, muttering insults like nerd or loser under his breath. If he needed to communicate something to me, he did so through our mother, refusing to speak to me directly. When I asked our mother why David wouldn't just talk to me, she would tell me to be more understanding. It was frustrating. I couldn't tell if David's behavior was just a byproduct of puberty or if he genuinely hated me. Over time, his insults became unbearable, and I longed to get away from him. I asked my mother several times to help mediate a conversation between us so we could resolve our issues, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. Whenever I asked her why David treated me the way he did, she would brush off the question, unwilling to face the reality of the situation. Eventually, I earned a scholarship to attend my dream university as a top student. When it was time for me to leave, my dad threw a party in my honor. Even my mom seemed proud of me, but David remained distant, barely acknowledging my success. On the day I left for school, I felt a mix of excitement and relief. I was finally escaping the toxic environment I had been trapped in for years. University was liberating. I made new friends, thrived in my classes, and built a life separate from the oppressive home I had known for so long. The constant fear of David's verbal attacks melted away, and I began to feel free. During my second year, I met my future wife, Karen, at a party. We clicked instantly. Coming from a religious background, Karen and I both believed in traditional values, so when we found out she was pregnant, during our final year, we decided to marry right after graduation. It was a small, joyful ceremony, and our families were happy for us. At that time, I believed Karen was the love of my life, and I was content in our marriage. For a long time, I envisioned our marriage as a lifelong commitment, one woman to love, one family to build. Even when other women showed interest in me over the years, I never strayed. I was devoted to Karen and our life together. But then came the betrayals. The first was an affair Karen had with her married coworker, an affair that spanned several years. The second was a fling with her ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. These affairs shattered the trust between us. I'll admit, some might call me naive for staying. Looking back, I can't completely disagree. But each time I discovered her infidelities, I chose to forgive her. I didn't want to raise our child in a broken home, and I believed we could move past her mistakes. The affair with her coworker happened when we were young, and I tried to chalk it up to youthful ignorance. For a while, it seemed like we were moving forward. Things seemed better, although I could never fully trust her again. But I did my best to let go of my doubts and work toward a fresh start. 4 years had passed since her second betrayal, and I felt secure in the decision I had made to stay and rebuild our marriage. However, 3 months ago, everything came crashing down once again. Karen confessed that she had been having yet another long-term affair. But that wasn't the worst part. She suggested that our son, who I had loved and raised, might not even be mine. Her confession hit me like a wrecking ball. It was as though the ground had crumbled beneath me, leaving me in free fall. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could she have done this to me? How could she have kept such a devastating secret for so long? Her reaction was cold, almost detached, as if she didn't care about the destruction her words had caused. She offered vague responses to my questions, and I was left in a fog of disbelief, betrayal, and confusion. What followed was an overwhelming sense of loss, not just for my marriage, but for the family I thought I had. I questioned everything. Was our life together a lie? Was the child I had raised truly my own? The betrayal left me gutted, I had forgiven her before, but this time I wasn't sure if I could. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. Everything I had built, everything I had worked for, our marriage, our family, now felt like a fragile illusion that had shattered into pieces too small to put back together. I kept pressing Karen for the truth, needing to know whether I was the father of the child I had raised since birth. After a long pause, she finally admitted that the father might be David, my own brother. My world stopped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, so I asked her to explain. She revealed that David and she had grown close during a holiday stay at my parents' house. It all started when I introduced Karen to my family during Thanksgiving, and she stayed with us until New Year's. While David had always been cold to me, he was unusually warm and polite to Karen. I was relieved, thinking it would help Karen feel welcome in my family. Karen, trying to be part of the family, spent time with my mom and noticed the tension between David and me. She asked about our relationship, and I opened up to her about the years of resentment and bullying I had endured from him. Karen wanted to help bridge the gap between us, so she began including David in our plans. When we'd watch movies, she invited David along. He even started picking the movies we watched. Slowly, David and I exchanged a few words, an improvement from his usual silent treatment. I also remember Karen and David playing video games together, but at the time, I didn't think much of it. I was just happy to see some peace between us. But then Karen dropped the bombshell. One day, while I wasn't around, David had confided in her about his struggles. With a recent breakup, feeling vulnerable, he struck up a closer friendship with her. Karen admitted that it started with harmless flirting from David, but it escalated. Soon enough, they crossed a line. The thought of my wife and brother together made me feel physically ill. Karen confessed that she felt guilty afterward, which explained why she left so abruptly to go home before New Year's, despite my efforts to convince her to stay. When we met back at college, she acted as if everything was fine, and I didn't suspect a thing. 2 weeks after the holidays, we found out she was pregnant. Karen admitted that she didn't know whether the child was mine or David's. Not knowing what to do, she decided to stay with me, thinking I was the more stable and dependable brother. That's why we got married. She thought I'd make a better father. I couldn't believe it. My whole world was unraveling. The child I had loved and raised might not even be mine. I asked Karen if her affair with David had continued, and after a long pause, she nodded. She explained that they had kept in touch over the years, their chemistry undeniable. They would sneak off to hotels, lying to me about working overtime or being on business trips. Half of her supposed business trips, Karen admitted, were actually romantic getaways with my brother. In my growing anger, I demanded to know why she had married me. If she wanted David, Karen said she didn't want to be the one to end the marriage. She admitted that she saw me as a wonderful father to our son, and over the years she had convinced herself to stay with me, but the truth was that she didn't know how to stop the affair once it started. I told Karen I appreciated her honesty, but I couldn't stay. I began packing my things, while Karen sobbed and pleaded for forgiveness. She expected me to yell or get angry, but I remained calm as I packed my clothes. Karen cried harder, insisting that if I loved her, I should fight for her. She kept saying that mistakes happen in every marriage, and that we could still fix things. I couldn't listen to it. When she saw I wasn't going to do anything, she changed tactics, saying that our son, whether he was mine or not, would be affected by a divorce. She begged me to stay for his sake, arguing that children shouldn't be raised in broken homes. I reminded her that I might not even be the boy's father, which only made her cry more and accused me of being cruel. It seemed like she believed nothing could drive me away, maybe because I had forgiven her infidelity before. I had stayed for the sake of our family, but this was too much. Karen kept insisting that it wasn't too late to fix things, but I didn't believe her anymore. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. Even if I somehow managed to forgive her, I would never forget that she had been with my brother. I've always believed in forgiveness because none of us are perfect, but this was far beyond what I could handle. I left her crying at the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went to my parents and told them everything. I explained how Karen and David had been secretly sleeping together for years. My mother predictably tried to defend David at first, insisting that her son would never do something so terrible to his own brother, but I was determined to expose the truth. I asked my parents to sit quietly while I called David, knowing I needed to catch him off guard. I wanted him to think it was just a private conversation between the two of us. When David answered, I confronted him. He immediately denied everything, swearing that Karen was lying. But when I told him that Karen had already confessed, he shifted the blame onto her, calling her characterless and saying it wasn't his fault if women were attracted to him. He even had the audacity to claim that he was the better-looking brother. At that moment, I told him I would tell everyone what he had done. David just laughed, saying no one would believe me because he was the golden child. But then, in that moment of arrogance, David unknowingly confirmed the truth. I thanked him for admitting everything, and then calmly informed him that our parents had heard the entire conversation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. David stammered, trying to salvage his story, but the damage was done. My mother, who had always been fiercely protective of David, sat in stunned silence. She could no longer deny the truth. My mother, devastated, demanded an explanation from David. He fumbled, making weak excuses and trying to shift all the blame onto Karen, but it was clear that he was trapped. For once, David couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. My mother, who had always favored him, now looked at him with a mix of disappointment and anger. My father, silent but stern, turned his back on him. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of vindication. After years of being tormented by David, the truth was finally out. David stood exposed, his actions laid bare for everyone to see. While I still had a lot of pain and confusion to work through, I at least had the satisfaction of knowing that my parents finally saw David for who he really was. As David stammered through his excuses, my father, normally a man of few words, could no longer hide his disappointment. He asked for the phone and spoke with a sternness that I hadn't heard in years. David, he began, his voice thick with disapproval, what you've done is not just a betrayal of your brother, it's a betrayal of this entire family. You slept with his wife, continued the affair after they were married, and thought you could get away with it. This isn't how I raised you. We taught you loyalty, respect, and the value of family. But you've thrown all of that away. There was a pause, and the silence on David's end was deafening. My father pressed on, letting his words sink in. I blame myself and your mother for not holding you accountable before, but that ends now. From this moment forward, you're cut off from everything. The college fund I set aside for you, it's gone. You'll have to figure out how to pay for school on your own. As for everything else, your expenses, your lifestyle, you're on your own there too. I won't be paying for anything anymore. I stood there watching as the brother, who had always gotten everything handed to him, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Part of me had wanted to yell at David, to make him feel the pain and betrayal he had caused me. But this, seeing my father, the man David had always sought approval from, finally disown him, was far more satisfying. My mother, though she had spent years defending David, even during his worst moments, had no words to offer in his defense this time. She simply stood by in stunned silence, realizing perhaps for the first time just how far David had fallen. After my father hung up, my mother approached me. To my surprise, she hugged me. Something we hadn't done in years. It was a small gesture, but it felt like an acknowledgement of all the pain I had endured. She whispered an apology for not believing me sooner, for all the years she had stood by David despite his cruelty. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, knowing that the family dynamic had shifted irreversibly. With my parents' support, I quickly filed for divorce from Karen. She and her lawyer tried to make the process as difficult as possible, even asking for alimony, but the affair with David worked heavily in my favor. We conducted a paternity test, and the results confirmed what Karen had already hinted at. David was the father of the child I had been raising. That revelation was like a knife to the heart. The boy I had loved, the child I had believed was mine, wasn't. Karen begged me not to abandon the boy, saying it wasn't his fault, that he still saw me as his father, but I couldn't do it. Every time I looked at him, I saw David. The betrayal was too deep, and I couldn't be the father he deserved. So I made the painful decision to walk away. I had to protect myself from the constant reminder of everything I had lost. After the divorce was finalized, I moved into a small apartment by myself. It was strange at first. I had married young and had never lived alone before, but in time I started to enjoy the freedom. It felt like a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. A few weeks later, my father called with news I wasn't expecting. He had decided to change his will. He explained that he didn't want David to receive anything from the family estate. The total sum of my father's asset, including his savings, retirement fund, and investments, was close to $2 million. My father said he planned to leave everything to me, with David getting just a symbolic $1. The only stipulation was that if my mother outlived my father, she would have the right to live in their house for the rest of her life, even though ownership would transfer to me. I was shocked. My father had always been strict but fair, and I never imagined he would go so far as to completely disinherit David. But he was adamant. David's betrayal had cut too deep, and in my father's eyes, there was no coming back from it. Somehow David found out about the changes to the will. Yesterday he called me for the first time since the confrontation. His voice was shaky, desperate. He started by apologizing, saying he regretted everything he had done. He told me that without our father's financial support, he was struggling to stay in school. And now that the paternity test had confirmed the child was his, Karen was hounding him for child support. He begged me to help him, to talk to our parents, and convince them to forgive him. I couldn't help but laugh. The audacity of him asking for my help after everything he had done was almost comical. I told him flatly that his problems weren't my concern. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. If he wanted to play house with Karen, then he could figure out how to support her and their child on his own. David tried to argue, saying that Karen was just as much to blame as he was, and I agreed. I reminded him that I had divorced her, and now she was his responsibility. He had no right to complain to me about her or the child, as they were his problem now, not mine. As our conversation went on, David grew more desperate, his voice breaking, as he tried to explain how everyone in the family had turned their backs on him. He said our grandparents, aunts, uncles, everyone had disowned him, and he felt completely alone. But I had no sympathy left. David had destroyed his own life, and he had no one to blame but himself. Before I hung up, I told him one final thing. David, you're not my brother anymore. You made that choice when you slept with my wife. Don't call me again. We're done. And with that, I ended the call. For the first time in a long time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The toxic relationships that had once held me back were gone. I was free. Since that conversation with David, I've replayed it in my mind countless times. Despite everything, despite the anger I feel toward him, hearing him cry, a sound I hadn't heard since we were kids, stirred something in me. I won't lie, it hurt a little to see him so helpless. That's why I'm here now, wondering if I should talk to our parents about him. Would that be the right thing to do? Or would it just make things worse? Update 1. Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are questioning why I cut ties with Henry, and some have even accused me of being heartless. I feel like I owe you an explanation. The truth is, I'm not comfortable raising another man's child, especially not my brother's. This isn't the same as being a stepdad. I was led to believe Henry was my biological son, only to later find out that he's actually David's. That truth devastated me, and I spent days crying over it. But the main reason I've decided to distance myself from Henry is that I need Karen out of my life. If I keep a relationship with Henry, Karen will always have a reason to intrude, and I just can't allow that. I know some of you may see this as selfish or cruel, but I'm doing what I need to in order to heal. Maybe one day I'll reconsider, but for now, I need my space. Update 2. A lot of you guessed correctly. It was my mother who told David about the changes to my dad's will, which is why David reached out to me in desperation. I confronted her about it in front of my father. She broke down, claiming that I had punished David enough and that he had already learned his lesson. My dad was furious. He told my mom point blank that if she truly believed what David had done was forgivable, then he could no longer stay married to her because he could never forgive such a betrayal. That shut her down. My dad made it clear that if she ever spoke to David again, and we found out she would need to pack her things and leave. As I've mentioned before, my dad is incredibly stubborn, and he wasn't making empty threats. I hope my mother has learned her lesson. Update 3, it's been 5 months since my last update, and I wanted to let you all know how things have progressed. My relationship with my parents has improved a lot. My dad and I have been golfing together every weekend, and he treats me more like a friend than just his son. Although my mother misses David, she has kept her distance from him. The last I heard about David was through a cousin who mentioned that David has been struggling. He's been asking family members for money and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford it. He and Karen are now living together, and David works part-time as a mechanic. They're raising Henry together, which I suppose is for the best. My parents and I never talk about David, and they don't bring him up anymore. As for me, I've been doing well. 2 months ago, I got promoted at work, which came with a nice pay increase. I'm not dating anyone right now. I feel like I still need time to heal from everything that's happened. I've started therapy, so we'll see how that goes. Thanks for watching and supporting me through this journey. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more real-life stories that